Guys, I've had some time to process this last weekend of fights that went down in Singapore, and I want to share my thoughts with you. I think when all of us revisit in our minds the last weekend of UFC Fight Night, Korean Zombie versus Holloway, and Road to UFC semifinals, I think I'm not alone in saying that there's a feeling of like both pain twinged with a little bit of celebration, still thinking about the exit of the Korean Zombie, the celebration, remembering all of the amazing things that he did for the sport of MMA that can never be taken away from any knockout loss or heartbreaking defeat. But still there is a little bit of sadness that we don't get him in the cage anymore, that there's going to be no more Korean Zombie moments in the UFC octagon. Personally, I was really impressed by everything that the Korean Zombie gave us last Saturday. I expected it to be a totally one-sided beatdown for Max Holloway, and while sure Holloway won every single round up to the third round knockout finish, I was really impressed by how often Chan Sung Jung was able to find really big punches that potentially even hurt Max Holloway, staggered him on the feet. He wasn't necessarily the faster fighter, he wasn't throwing in a lot of volume, but he was able to press a really hard pace, and I felt like he was really gunning to just knock Max Holloway out cold. And for that, I was really impressed. If you go back and watch my breakdown video of UFC Singapore, I actually did predict a third round TKO or knockout finish of the Korean Zombie by Max Holloway, but I didn't expect it to be like that. I expected Max Holloway to be landing flush combinations over and over from the beginning, maybe a couple shots here and there right away by Korean Zombie, but for Holloway to take away halfway through the first round and then it just get uglier and uglier and uglier up until the ref stops it in the third round. But instead we had a much closer back and forth war where Max Holloway was still landing much more often than the Korean Zombie. You felt like this was actually kind of a competitive fight, and Korean Zombie truly did give us his best up until the end of the fight, where he basically was just like, you know what, one of us is going away right here, right now, and it ended up being him. But love the way the UFC handled the moment. They gave us a lot of silence, a lot of opportunity to just watch. So if you know the Korean Zombie, you know he's got his own gym. You know he's got several fighters that are coming up through the ranks in South Korea. And that's one thing that is a little bit of a bittersweet moment on the sweet side. We'll get to see Korean Zombie as a coach. We'll get to see a lot of fighters continue on his legacy, most likely playing the Zombie song as they walk into the cage, as many of them already are. So this isn't the last that we've seen of the spirit of Chan Sung Jung, the Korean Zombie. So if anything, be encouraged by that. As I'm still just like processing through the whole weekend, I want to share a couple of my other thoughts that I had. I thought Erin Blanchfield gave the performance of her life against Taila Santos. And some folks may disagree just because the fight was pretty close at times and Erin Blanchfield wasn't able to like rattle off a lot of incredibly impactful offense. A lot of things that she tried got stuffed. The fact that it was Taila Santos is an incredibly difficult fighter to look good against. We saw how she carried Valentina Shevchenko to a split decision, and Shevchenko probably one of her least convincing performances of her whole career. Erin Blanchfield put herself in that category, not with a split decision, but with unanimous decision, most likely winning the second 2 rounds of that fight. And I thought the way that she was able to continue to put pressure and put offense on Taila Santos. She kept working hard for that takedown. Her work rate was incredible against Santos. And again, if you look at my preview video, which let me just give a unashamed shout out for, I picked 11 of the 13 fights correctly, and 6 of those I picked to perfection. So if you ever in the future are wanting to bet on fights, I'm not saying that my advice will be the most thorough, but I have had a pretty good track record, just saying. But in my opinion, Erin Blanchfield has showed us that she is ready for that title shot. In my opinion, the only thing that would take that title shot away from her is if Manon Fiorot is able to win by knockout against Rose Namajunas. Otherwise, I don't know of anything that Rose or Manon Fiorot could do to convince me that they deserve it more than Erin Blanchfield. Erin Blanchfield entered the sport of MMA. She was coming off EBI, looking really good as a teenager, and then making the transition to MMA, but she has rounded out her striking. She was able to beat Taila Santos, a Muay Thai striker, on the feet pretty convincingly in that regard. So for me, I'm ready to put Erin Blanchfield up against Alexa Grasso or Valentina Shevchenko should she win next month. Let's make it happen. Now, there's a lot of other really good stuff that happened at UFC Singapore, but the only other one that I'll comment on is Song Kanan. Kind of an odd one, odd guy to pick out of the prelims, but overall Asians didn't have the best night at UFC Singapore. Rinya Nakamura looked pretty dang good, but Song Kanan I think has been one of the forgotten Chinese fighters. He took a lot of time off, and really most of his wins are over pretty low level UFC competition, but his losses are against really high level competition at welterweight. A lot of people were picking Bedoya in this fight because Bedoya had a really exciting performance against Chaos Williams, and personally this was one of the few picks that I got wrong. I picked Rolando Bedoya to beat Song Kanan basically because I expected the whole fight to go as round one did, where Bedoya is just landing much more volume against Song Kanan, who seemed to be starting a little bit slow. Now, some folks would argue that Song Kanan was being too cautious and hesitant, had a hard time pulling the trigger. I don't necessarily see his performance as an inability or anything that he did wrong. I think he was actually just making a lot of really intelligent reads and was very careful about the punches that he put out there, because you saw in round two he picked up the pace because I think he had made the reads that he needed and started to land some really accurate and technical powerful strikes against Bedoya, and I thought that his maturity was really evident. He was very efficient with his game and showed that he is a level above Rolando Bedoya. Was really impressed with his performance. I'm not sure still how he's going to be able to do if he re-enters some of those elite level competitions, but really impressed with Song Kanan, and I think his work with Kill Cliff FC is really paying off and showing, and excited to see what's next for Song Kanan. The real emphasis of this video is Road to UFC. I've covered this tournament extensively over my MMA media career, and this past weekend was a little bit of a different experience for me watching it, as a lot of fights, in fact all but one, went to a decision from the tournament fights. A lot of fights were close. Some fights I would even say were a little bit of a dud, but there's a couple things I do want to comment on. But before I get into the semifinals, can we just talk about Naim Jargel's absolute destruction of Peter Daniso? Daniso looked incredible in his last Road to UFC fight, winning by a flying knee knockout, and I expected this to be a lot more even, with Daniso potentially getting some of the better of the striking matches, but Naim Jargel just lit the fuse to the rocket from the first second of the fight and never gave Daniso even a chance to get into the fight, just blasting him away with punches and choking him out unconscious 62 seconds in the first round. I don't know why you would ever deny that guy a UFC contract. What else does he have to do? He looked incredible. He beat Top Noi by split decision in his last Road to UFC fight, and now he just fires away and takes out one of the best, if not the best, Thai male prospect in just over a minute. Naim Jargel absolutely belongs in the UFC. To fight for Mongolia, that was probably the most exciting moment from the whole event of Road to UFC this August, and UFC making a mistake if they don't sign him now. But getting into the semi-final fights, now I really like something Paul Felder said, and I kind of want to expand on it. He mentioned something that a lot of these fighters really are just trying to get to the finals, and some people may say the fights were a little bit slower, lacking of finishes, and yeah, that's right, but I think we can forgive these fighters for the most part, because this tournament is a lot different from something like Dana White's Contender Series, where you are trying to fight and convince and make an argument every single fight that you belong in the UFC. And there's a little bit of that there in Road to UFC, but all that really matters is the finals, impressing in the finals. This middle round of the tournament is kind of prone to be a little bit slower. The first round of the tournament, you're gonna weed out most of the fighters fighting at a lower level, so good chance you'll see some finishes as some of the elite guys are fighting some of the guys on the lower level. But the middle round of the tournament, really a lot of great fighters, and a good chance that these guys are gonna fight again in December, just 4 months later after fighting in May. So really active schedule. Who knows what kind of injuries they're already bringing in, and if you can make a game plan to have the easiest route to victory in the semifinals, then you should take that, even if it's not the most exciting. If I'm fighting in the semifinals, I'm trying to avoid injury, and honestly, coasting to victory to fight in the finals is not such a bad thing. So you saw performances from Lee Kai-Wen, from Shin Haraguchi that were pretty slow, not a lot of dramatic moments, but it is what it is. Those guys have punched their ticket to the finals. So if there's any boring or slower performances from these semifinals, I think we can forgive them this time around. These guys just trying to keep going. In the finals, a little bit more important to impress the bosses, because even if you lose, you still get an opportunity to win a UFC contract. We saw this with Ja last year, that he didn't win the contract in the finals, even though he had a really close fight, lost by split decision. In my opinion, should have been signed to the UFC, but not a terrible thing to give him 3 more fights under his belt before he eventually does, if he does. And by the way, I thought Ja looked great. I thought his striking, we got to see a little bit more of that. That looked great. He's gonna fight Lee Kai-Wen in the finals. Teammate versus teammate fight. That could be really interesting, especially if they hold this at the UFC Shanghai PI. It's almost like a teammate sparring match in their own gym, if you really think about it. I'm not sure if one of those guys is gonna have to leave and train somewhere else, but it could be a little bit awkward if both of them are training at the UFC PI. Regardless, both of those guys already know each other's game plan. One guy, Lee Kai-Wen, is clearly more of a striker. Ja clearly more of a grappler. Does each guy kind of know each other's secrets? Does each guy know how to implement their game plan against each other and nullify the other's strengths? That's a big question going into the finals. If I'm thinking about the upset of the night, I would give that to either Jinyu Shirie or Xiao Long. I told you guys in my Road to UFC breakdown on last week's podcast that I thought Jinyu Shirie could be the upset of the night going against Choi Sung-gook, and he was. He looked incredible. It wasn't a fight that gave you a lot of dramatic moments, but Choi Sung-gook, again, is a guy that's really hard to look good against. And Jinyu Shirie was able to use the distance in a really commanding way, was able to use that straight right and stay out of harm's way himself. And that's honestly the best kind of game plan, right? So Jinyu Shirie really coming out as an impressive prospect that is surprising a lot of folks, beating a finalist from last year's Road to UFC. And then my other pick would be Xiao Long. Xiao Long has been a guy that has underperformed under the bright lights for really his whole career. He's looked dominant when he fights in China, but when he fought for Contender Series, greatly underperformed and had to exit from last year's Road to UFC because of injury. And then in the opening round this year, I thought against Shuya Kamikubo that Shuya had pretty much like a gimme fight going into the finals. He was one of the strongest favorites in any of the tournament weight classes. Xiao Long showing his work rate, showing that he would be a hard guy to take down, and Shuya Kamikubo basically just emptied the gas tank against Xiao Long and couldn't hang with his work rate. And then Xiao Long able to show his striking, looked pretty good on the feet. Overall, not the most exciting fight, but a really interesting fight just to see Xiao Long maybe finally come out of his shell a little bit, put some of the pieces together. He's still really young, like 23 years old or something. So I think the best is yet to come with Xiao Long. Really surprising fight in the finals, having Xiao Long versus Lee Chung-ho of Korea. And by the way, can I just say I'm glad we got at least one guy from South Korea in the finals. That would have been really sad if it was all Chinese fighters. As much as I like the China guys, glad we got one fighter in Lee Chung-ho. Lee looked amazing as well, but really interesting and surprising fight. There were some really strong fighters at bantamweight, but none of those guys are even making it to the finals. So interested to see if one guy can have a breakout performance against the other. Glad that both of them are getting the shot. And the fight of the night for me was Rongju versus Kim Song-wook. Rongju almost feels like it's unfair that he's even in this tournament as the one guy that has already fought in the UFC multiple times and has looked like it in every single one of his Road to UFC fights, showing that he's maybe a level or two above everybody. His striking and punching power has been hard for everyone to deal with. His takedown defense, I think he's probably going to win this lightweight tournament. And with Rongju winning, guys, Team China went 5-1 at the semifinals. There is a Chinese fighter in every single fight going into the finals, and one of those fights is a China versus China fight. Is this like getting unfair now that we have the UFC PI and we've had fighters that have been in that system for several years? Is this starting to get a little bit unfair towards those fighters? The UFC PI has had some stumbles out the gate, but they're starting to really put things together. They're figuring out their systems and they looked so dang good, have so many good things to say about all the coaching staff at the UFC PI in Shanghai for Dean, Amasinger, Jake Winwood, Tim Roberts, all those guys. Can name so many more, but they deserve a lot of credit for what they've been able to do for those UFC PI fighters. And I think that we're gonna see a lot of Chinese guys enter the UFC from the season of Road to UFC. Thinking about that though, I was just starting to think about like, where is Road to UFC headed? What is the future like for this show? I wonder if we're going to reach a point where we've tapped the market for Road to UFC, pulling in 32 fighters from Asia every single year. I think that we can do that for several years to come as long as the Asian market is healthy. You think about when Road to UFC started, it really started at the end of the pandemic era where there wasn't a whole lot of Asian MMA going on, but now that Asian MMA is fully back, the events are coming in much higher frequency. There's new promotions starting all the time throughout China, throughout Indonesia, all throughout Asia. I think from what I'm seeing, the pace should be able to keep up with the level of talent that's being produced. I think that especially a lot of countries like India and Indonesia are getting a lot of renewed fan interest. And so I think we're gonna see a lot more talent being pumped out from other Asian countries, but maybe for the first couple years, it's gonna be a lot of China, Korea, and Japan. It also makes me wonder how many repeat fighters are we going to see? Are we going to see Choi Sung-gook again next year? That would be really interesting if he rattles together like 12 straight Road to UFC fights. And he's still really young, right? I'm sure that we're gonna see guys like Darmisi back in the tournament next year. So we could get to a point where half, if not more, of the tournament is a lot of repeat fighters and there's just a few new fighters added every single year. But for Choi, is he gonna go back to the Korean MMA scene, which I think he should. I think he should fight some fighters that are the same level, if not a little bit lower than him. String together a couple wins, maybe even a couple finishes. I think that could benefit him a lot. So maybe not every fighter should just do Road to UFC every year, but I think it is good when they can go out into the regional scene and add together a couple wins that are outside of the tournament format. So fortunately, I think Asian MMA is healthy enough to sustain an annual Road to UFC. There was a couple guys this year that I was like, I don't think that you were probably the UFC's first choice to enter this tournament, but because some other guys couldn't make it, that's how you got in. But let's look at the finals. So at flyweight, we've got Jinyu Shirie versus Ray Tsuruya. Really, if Jinyu Shirie can defend the takedown, I think that he stands a really good chance against Ray Tsuruya. Ray showed an incredible adhesion to his opponent, Mark Climaco, this semifinal round. This is gonna be a really tough fight for Jinyu Shirie. He's gonna be tested. But did Ray Tsuruya gas a little bit? He was working so hard in that 3-round decision against Climaco. Maybe he'll work on his strength and conditioning a little bit. I'll probably still lean a little bit towards him just because he is so dominant on the ground. But Jinyu Shirie also has pretty good grappling. So I think this fight could be closer than a lot of people assume. Lee Chong-ho against Xiao Long. If Lee Chong-ho can't get Xiao Long to the ground, then I think this is probably Xiao's fight. That is such a tough fight to pick, but I'm gonna go Xiao Long there just because I feel like he's got a lot more experience and I think that he's gonna be able to have a game plan to beat Lee Chong-ho. Lee Chong-ho had some dicey moments in that fight against Darmisi up until the time Darmisi gassed. So I feel like Xiao Long, even though he's been really inconsistent at the high level in the past, I wanna lean towards him in the finals. In the finals, we've got Lee Kai-Win against Ija, and for me, it's Ija all the way. I think he's going to be able to get Lee Kai-Win down, and I think that we're going to see Ija get a submission, if not a dominant. Lee Kai-Win has incredible punching power. Although he didn't look great against Koyakonda last weekend, I think he will come out more guns a-blazing in the finals. Especially, he doesn't want to be on his back for 3 rounds, so I think he's going to be looking to take Ija out of there, and he very well could find the mark. I think Ija is going to take this one and finally get his UFC contract. And then in the finals, we've got Rung Ju against Shin Haraguchi, and as good and as big of a believer as I am in Shin Haraguchi, it's just hard for me to pick against the more complete MMA game of Rung Ju, that UFC experience. I think he does punch his ticket back into the UFC. I think, yeah, he's probably going to get taken down a time or two, but his skills are just so much more complete. I think he's eventually going to be able to stuff a couple takedowns and really wear and damage Shin Haraguchi on the feet. But I don't know, do you agree with me? I feel like maybe some of those picks could be pretty polarizing. Happy to hear your thoughts in the comments below. UFC Singapore in the books, Road to UFC semifinals in the books. Hopefully we get Road to UFC finals going down in China at the end of this year. If there's any news on that, you can count on me to bring that to you guys. I will try to figure out what I can about any future Chinese UFC events going down at the end of this year. Really, as usual, just love covering Road to UFC this weekend, guys. It was so fun. UFC Singapore, such a fun event. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. Follow me on all the other social media channels at MMA Ecosystem, and we'll see you next time.